In this video, we'll break down what medieval soldiers really did after the fighting stopped. The fate of defeated warriors' wives exposes the brutal reality behind the so-called Age of Chivalry. Number 1. The collapse of protection. When a medieval army collapsed, the fall of its warriors marked the beginning of a far worse chapter for their families. The wives of defeated soldiers weren't treated as bystanders. They instantly became part of the spoils of war. In those times, a woman's safety depended entirely on her husband's status or the army protecting her town. Once that protection vanished, she was left to the mercy of the victors. Records from sieges across Europe and the Crusader states show that after battles, soldiers routinely seized women, not only for labor or ransom, but also to demonstrate total dominance over the defeated side. The collapse of protection was more than physical danger. It was the destruction of identity. A woman in medieval Europe was legally tied to her husband's authority. Once he died or was captured, she lost property rights, social position, and any claim to safety. Many were forced into servitude or taken to military camps. Others were sold in slave markets from Eastern Europe to North Africa. Chroniclers wrote that, "The men were slain and the women taken," a phrase repeated through many wars, from the Norman invasions to the Crusades. The Church claimed to promote mercy, but its influence often stopped at the battlefield. Bishops might condemn brutality in words, yet most armies ignored them. In feudal society, women of defeated warriors symbolized humiliation. Breaking them meant breaking the spirit of an entire enemy tribe or kingdom. For commanders, allowing soldiers to plunder civilians kept morale high and served as a grim reward. There are documented cases where noble women were forced into marriages to legitimize the conqueror's claim to land. Peasant women, meanwhile, faced an even harsher fate. They had no ransom value, no title, and no one to plead for them. For them, survival often depended on submission. Behind every medieval victory was this silent aftermath: homes burned, families scattered, and women stripped of everything that once defined their lives. The fall of protection was not a single moment of defeat. It was a slow, relentless dismantling of dignity, carried out in the name of conquest and power. Number 2. Enslavement and forced servitude. When an army crushed its enemy in the Middle Ages, the impact went far beyond the battlefield. In many instances, the wives of defeated warriors were forced into enslavement or servitude. Across medieval Europe, the practice of turning captured women into laborers, concubines, or trade goods was more common than many modern viewers realize. Historical evidence shows that captive women often fetched higher prices than men in the market of war captives. In the Baltic region, for example, raids in the 12th and 13th centuries captured Christian women, who were then sold into slavery in pagan lands. This trade illustrates how the wives of fallen warriors, many of them civilian and unarmed, were treated as spoils. They had no status in the new order, and were often forced into roles far below what their identities had been before the battle. Documentation from England and Ireland shows that these women were sometimes held in camps or taken to foreign lands, where their value was recognized by their captors. Once enslaved, their lives changed drastically. Some became household servants for the conquerors, cleaning and cooking under harsh conditions. Others were forced into sexual servitude or consigned to bleak lives in slave markets. The fact that many women were taken and few returned emphasizes the long-term consequences of defeat. The legal and moral frameworks of the time were supposed to protect non-combatants, yet the reality was very different. Wives of defeated soldiers often lacked any formal protection because their men were no longer able to protect them. Their enslavement served not just as labor exploitation, but as a visible marker of the enemy's total defeat. In addition to physical enslavement, there was social erasure. These women lost their homes, their identity as the wife of a warrior, and any claim to security in their own lands. Some scholars argue that the politics of captivity treated women as currency in the negotiations that followed battles. For your audience, this means, when a medieval castle fell, the horror didn't stop at the gates. For the warrior's wife, the fight was just beginning. The transformation from free spouse to captive servant reveals a brutal dimension of war often left out of epic stories of knights and valor. Modern viewers tend to focus on the clash of steel and the fall of strongholds, but the stories of forced servitude show what defeat meant for the women connected to the warriors. Their lives were changed irrevocably, and many were never heard from again. Number 3. Humiliation as a weapon of war. In medieval warfare, humiliation was not a side effect, it was a tactic. When soldiers defeated an enemy, they often extended the victory beyond the battlefield by publicly shaming the wives of their fallen foes. Such acts served to send a clear signal: the enemy is broken, their honor gone, their women exposed. This form of degradation intensified the defeat and turned personal loss into communal spectacle. In some sieges, the defeated defenders were forced into submission rituals. In one example from 13th century Europe, the inhabitants of a surrendered town were made to march out in humiliating clothing and under armed guard. Women in those contexts suffered similar or worse outcomes. Their honor, which in the medieval mindset was tied to the protection of their men, and their household, became a target. Soldiers exploited this by parading, mocking or abusing women connected to defeated warriors to break morale of the remaining resistance. Humiliation also took the form of forced exposure to the conqueror's gaze. Women formerly protected by their husbands, now stripped of protection, sometimes literally. They could be made to serve in the camp of the victors, stripped of their former status, used as visible trophies of conquest. While sources rarely name the women, historians of slavery and trafficking note that the auction block and slave market carried an abject humiliation alongside the sale of female captives. By being forced into labor, servitude, or sexual exploitation, these women were living proof that their family's defeat meant a collapse of honor and status. Humiliation was also symbolic. The act of seizing or mistreating the wife of a defeated warrior did more than harm one person. It publicly denounced the warrior's power and lineage. Medieval elites understood that honor was collective. When the defender failed, all of his household became vulnerable. The conquering side therefore used the mistreatment of women to solidify domination. Some academic works argue that in war, the violation of women was used to destroy the identity of the defeated group. Moreover, the legal and moral codes of the time offered little protection. Although church councils, treaties, and chivalric ideals spoke of sparing civilians and non-combatants, in practice these rules were often ignored. The rhetoric of mercy did not extend to women connected to the defeated. Their humiliation was rationalized as a part of spoils, of justice, or simply of victory. That gap between ideals and reality left women exposed to some of the worst consequences of defeat. For any modern audience, this means that when we think of medieval battles, we should remember that a large part of the aftermath was not about castles or banners. It was about the invisible battlefield of dignity. The humiliation of wives of defeated warriors reveals how war targeted not only fighting men, but their families, their identity, and their legacy. Number 4. Political exploitation through marriage. After defeat in the Middle Ages, marriage turned into a tool of control. Wives and daughters of fallen warriors were pushed into unions that secured land and loyalty for the victors. Lords claimed legal powers over the marriages of widows and heirs. This was part of feudal wardship and marriage rights that let a lord direct whom a woman married and profit from the arrangement. These rights increased a lord's revenue and political reach. Kings and guardians often treated a woman's marriage like property to be managed or sold. Administrative records show that guardians could arrange or monetize the marriages of wards. The practice affected both male and female heirs and worked as a tax on inheritance. Consent existed on paper, but was weak in practice. Conquerors used marriage to lock down conquered lands. After 1066, Norman rulers tightened control over inheritance by widows and daughters. Many English heiresses were married to Norman men, so estates stayed loyal to the new regime. Contemporary analysis notes that these forced or pressure-driven matches were common tools for stabilizing power after the conquest. Some legal texts tried to limit abuse. Magna Carta stated that a widow should not be forced to remarry. It also confirmed that a lord or the king still had veto power over her choice. The rule looked protective, but left wide room for pressure. A widow's future could still be steered by those who held her lands and legal rights. Marriage policy also shaped custody and the next generation. If a warrior died, his underage heir, and estates could fall under a guardian. That guardian benefited from the lands and could arrange the heir's marriage to cement alliances. Scholars describe how guardians used marriages to reward their followers or bind rival families. The marriage could even be sold to the highest bidder. Regional practice varied, but the political logic was similar. In Iberia, family consent rules existed in law, yet powerholders still leveraged marriages to secure territory and status. Across Latin Europe, marriage settlements moved wealth and titles between houses and across borders. Women's consent was uneven. Documents and case studies show frequent gaps between legal ideals and enforcement. Coverture and dower rules complicated the picture. A married woman's legal identity was covered by her husband. On his death, she had dower rights on paper. Yet enforcement depended on politics and the strength of her protectors. Studies of widows in the Magna Carta era stress how often protection failed when power interests intervened. In short, marriage functioned as a post-battle weapon. It transferred land. It silenced rival claims. It turned the wives of defeated warriors into gateways for conquest that continued long after the fighting stopped.
Number 5. Erasure from historical records. In the chronicles of medieval warfare, the wives of defeated warriors rarely appear. After battles ended and armies moved on, their existence often vanished from official records. Medieval scribes, who were mostly men working under royal or religious patronage, focused on kings, commanders, and territorial victories. Civilian suffering, especially that of women, was considered irrelevant to political history. As a result, the experiences of those women, captivity, displacement, or forced servitude, were erased from the written narrative. Court archives and land registers show another pattern of silence. When a husband died in war, his widow's legal status often changed overnight. Without male protection, she could lose her property or title, making her invisible to the law. Documents that did mention women often described them only as assets connected to estates or marriage alliances. Their personal experiences or hardships were rarely recorded. Many medieval laws defined women's rights through their husbands, so once a man was gone, his wife effectively disappeared from the record as a legal person. Archaeologists now fill part of that silence with physical evidence. Excavations at destroyed castles and abandoned villages reveal everyday items such as tools, jewelry, and household objects that once belonged to women. These small traces tell us that life continued for them long after history stopped mentioning their names. Yet for every artifact found, countless personal stories remain unknown. Most women left behind no letters or diaries, and even church documents mention them only when tied to male relatives. The loss of written accounts was also a deliberate political act. Victorious rulers often destroyed family records of the defeated to eliminate claims of inheritance or revenge. When castles burned, family charters and lineage documents were lost, taking with them the only proof that these women had ever held status or land. Many noble families whose men died in rebellion or foreign wars were erased entirely from genealogies by the new regime. This historical silence wasn't just an accident. It was part of how power worked in the Middle Ages. By excluding the stories of defeated women, chroniclers helped shape a version of history centered on male heroism and conquest. What remains today is a distorted view of the past, one that celebrates victory but hides the human cost paid by those left behind. For the wives of defeated warriors, being forgotten by history was the final cruelty, turning real suffering into silence that lasted for centuries. Number 6. The reality behind medieval glory. In modern retellings, the Middle Ages shine with shiny armor, heroic knights and victory banners waving in the wind. Yet beneath this surface, the reality for many was far grimmer, especially for the wives of defeated warriors. When a fortress fell or an army routed the defenders, the aftermath didn't end with cheers and loot. For these women, it meant living consequences that outlasted the clash of swords. Medieval warfare promised glory to soldiers, but the concept of honor and chivalry often stopped before protecting civilians. Scholars distinguish between the idealized rules of war and how battles were really fought. In fact, many chronicles acknowledge that after walls were breached, soldiers turned to looting, abducting, and forcing women into servitude. This contradiction underlies the gap between the celebrated memory of medieval victory and its darker human cost. For the wives of fallen warriors, the glory of victory on one side translated into permanent damage on the other. Their homes might be sacked, their husbands killed or captured, their status stripped away. What the victors called recompense or prize was, to those women, a marker of lost identity. The narrative of heroic conquest didn't include the silent removal of protection from families whose men were defeated. In this sense, the real price of glory was paid by people who never held shields. Another aspect is how medieval sources obscure these realities. Battle poems, annals, and chronicles celebrated kings and armies, but rarely detailed the fate of civilian women after a loss. That silence reinforced the image that war was glorious rather than destructive. Modern research shows that the consequences of defeat for women forced labor, change of status, abandonment were widespread. By focusing only on military success, we miss this costly side of victory. The economic dimension adds a final layer. Soldiers expecting pay or land often settled their reward by seizing families and households. The wives of defeated warriors could be turned into dependents of the victor's household or into bargaining chips. The official history of medieval glory neglects how defeat rewrote the social map for hundreds of women across Europe. In short, when you hear tales of medieval glory, imagine the banners raised, the trumpets sounded, but also imagine the women whose lives began when the trumpets faded. Their stories don't fit the heroic mold. They reveal that for some people, the end of a battle was only the beginning of a new, harsher reality.